Back before the first brick was laid or the first ship anchored in these waters. Back to when Manhattan was simply land, waiting silently for the moment that would change everything. Long before the first European eye glimpsed these shores, Manhattan existed in a state of profound stillness. Picture dense forests where skyscrapers now stand, their canopies filtering sunlight into scattered pools of gold on the forest floor. Streams carved gentle paths through the bedrock, the same bedrock that would one day support the weight of architectural giants. The air carried the scent of salt water and pine, undisturbed by the smoke and steel that would eventually define this place. The Lenape people moved through this landscape with an intimacy we've almost forgotten how to imagine. They didn't see property lines or real estate value. They saw fishing grounds that provided sustenance season after season, hunting paths worn smooth by generations of footsteps, gathering places where knowledge passed from elder to child. The island was not wilderness to them. It was home, measured not in acres or dollars, but in relationships, in stories, in the rhythms of planting and harvest. The shoreline itself was different then, more generous, more forgiving. Marshlands extended where piers now jut into the harbor. Oyster beds carpeted the shallows, so abundant that they formed natural reefs. Birds migrated through in numbers that would darken the sky, their calls echoing across water that ran clear enough to see straight to the bottom. This was Manhattan in its original state. Patient, abundant, unsuspecting of the transformation that approached across the Atlantic. When the first European ships appeared on the horizon in the early 1600s, they brought more than just sailors and cargo. They carried entire worldviews, economic systems, and invisible passengers in the form of diseases against which the Lenape had no defense. But in those initial moments of contact, none of this was yet apparent. What began was simply trade, the most human of interactions, as old as civilization itself. The Lenape offered furs, the pelts of beaver and otter that kept them warm through brutal winters. To them, these were renewable resources, gifts from the natural world to be harvested with respect and gratitude. The Europeans offered metal tools, glass beads, cloth woven in patterns the Lenape had never seen. Each side believed they were getting the better deal. The Lenape gained tools that made daily labor easier. The Europeans gained furs that would fetch extraordinary prices in the fashion markets of Amsterdam and London. This exchange seemed innocent, even beneficial. Representatives from the Dutch West India Company smiled and gestured, trying to bridge the language barrier with goodwill and hand signals. The Lenape welcomed these strange visitors with curiosity, perhaps seeing opportunity in these new relationships. Nobody could have predicted that these simple transactions were the opening moves in a transformation that would erase one world and build another in its place. The beads and tools were not just objects. They were the seeds of a new economic order, one that measured everything in profit and loss, one that recognized no value that couldn't be calculated, bought, or sold. As months became years, the balance began to shift in ways both subtle and catastrophic. The fur trade intensified, and with it came a fundamental transformation of Lenape society. Traditional hunting patterns, once guided by sustainability and spiritual practice, gave way to commercial harvesting. The beaver, once hunted in moderation, now faced systematic depletion. The old ways, passed down through countless generations, collided with market demands emanating from cities thousands of miles away. But commerce was the lesser destroyer. Invisible and merciless, European diseases swept through Lenape communities like fire through dry grass. Smallpox, measles, influenza, these were plagues against which indigenous immune systems had no defense. Entire villages were decimated. Elders who carried the accumulated wisdom of centuries died in waves, taking their knowledge with them. The social fabric that held communities together began to tear under the weight of grief and loss. The Dutch settlers, motivated by profit and expansion, began to view the land itself differently. Where the Lenape saw a shared landscape to be lived with, the Europeans saw property to be owned, divided, and exploited. Deeds were signed, though the very concept of selling land was foreign to Lenape understanding. How could one sell the earth, the water, the air? It was like trying to sell the sky. Yet legal frameworks from across the ocean were imposed, and gradually, inevitably, the Lenape found themselves displaced from lands their ancestors had walked for thousands of years. What began as exchange had calcified into dispossession. The peaceful beginning had led, step by step, to a breaking of bonds that had connected people to place since time beyond memory. New Amsterdam emerged not from careful urban planning or architectural vision, but from improvisation and necessity. The early settlement was a collection of rough wooden structures clustered near the southern tip of Manhattan, facing the harbor that would become its lifeline to the world. There was no grid, no zoning, no grand boulevard. Streets formed where people walked most often, winding around obstacles, following the path of least resistance. Pigs and cattle roamed freely through these muddy lanes, their presence both a source of food and a constant nuisance. Residents threw waste into the streets, creating conditions that bred disease and discomfort. Buildings leaned against each other, constructed hastily from whatever materials were available, often by people who had never built anything before arriving in this new world. The settlement stank of animals, refuse, and unwashed humanity packed into tight quarters. This was not the gleaming city of tomorrow. This was a frontier outpost learning to survive day by day. Fires broke out regularly in the wooden structures. Flooding occurred when storms pushed harbor water into the low-lying areas. Food shortages struck when ships were delayed or destroyed. The people of New Amsterdam were not heroes or visionaries. They were farmers, traders, laborers, and opportunists trying to carve out existence in a place that offered both promise and peril in equal measure. The messiness of it all, the chaos and improvisation, would become part of the city's DNA, a characteristic that persists even now in the organized chaos of modern New York. At the heart of New Amsterdam stood two institutions that defined the boundaries of acceptable life: the fort and the church. The fort was more than a military installation. It was the physical manifestation of the Dutch West India Company's authority, a reminder carved in wood and earth that this settlement existed for profit, and profit required order. Within its walls, officials made decisions that rippled through every aspect of colonial existence. Trade regulations, tax collection, criminal punishment, all emanated from this center of power. The church stood nearby, its presence equally commanding if less overtly threatening. The Dutch Reformed faith provided spiritual structure, but it also reinforced social hierarchies. The Director General, most famously Peter Stuyvesant, wielded both secular and religious authority like a weapon against disorder. Stuyvesant was no democrat. He was a company man, convinced that discipline and control were the only paths to prosperity in this uncertain environment. Interestingly, the colony practiced a form of religious tolerance, allowing Jews, Catholics, and other faiths to reside within its boundaries. But this tolerance had limits and motives. It existed because diversity attracted settlers, and settlers meant labor, trade, and growth. Freedom of worship was permitted, but challenges to economic or political authority were crushed swiftly. The message was clear: believe what you wish in your private moments, but in the public sphere, in matters of commerce and governance, the company's word was absolute. Faith and profit coexisted, but when they conflicted, profit always prevailed. By 1653, New Amsterdam faced threats from multiple directions. English colonies pressed from the north and east, their ambitions growing with every passing year. Indigenous groups, increasingly resentful of displacement and broken agreements, represented another source of tension. Within the colony itself, anxiety simmered about the fragility of Dutch control in this distant corner of the world. The response was the construction of a defensive wall along the northern edge of the settlement, running roughly along what would eventually become Wall Street. This barrier was not impressive by European military standards. It was wooden, hastily constructed, more symbolic than truly formidable. But symbols matter, especially to people living on the edge of the known world. The wall said, "We are here, we are staying, and we will defend what we claim." Yet the wall also revealed profound insecurity. A confident, secure colony would not need such crude fortifications. The barrier marked the limits of control, the point beyond which safety could not be guaranteed. It divided the settled from the unsettled, the commercial from the wild. Every time residents passed through its gates, they were reminded of the precariousness of their situation. The wall stood as a monument to fear, a wooden confession that despite all the trade, all the building, all the prayers and proclamations, New Amsterdam remained vulnerable, uncertain, and desperately aware that its existence was far from guaranteed. The economic engine of New Amsterdam ran on the docks, in the warehouses, through the market stalls that lined the waterfront. Ships arrived carrying manufactured goods from Europe, textiles and tools and luxuries that colonists craved. Those same ships departed loaded with raw materials, furs and timber that would feed European industries and fashion trends. This cycle of exchange was the settlement's reason for existing, its justification for all the hardship and sacrifice. But this engine required fuel, and that fuel was human labor in its most brutal forms. Indentured servants worked off the debt of their passage, surrendering years of their lives for the chance at eventual freedom. Enslaved Africans, brought against their will into this system, performed the back-breaking work of building infrastructure, loading cargo, clearing land. The contributions of these forced laborers were fundamental to the colony's survival, yet their humanity was systematically denied by the very structures they built. The inequality was stark and unapologetic. Company officials and successful merchants lived in relative comfort while the majority struggled. Yet this disparity was accepted as natural, even necessary. The prevailing philosophy held that hierarchy served everyone by creating order and prosperity, that many benefited little from this prosperity, while a few accumulated significant wealth, was simply how the world worked. The docks, canals, and markets that defined New Amsterdam's landscape were monuments not just to commerce, but to the exploitation that made that commerce possible. Despite the harsh conditions and rigid hierarchies, life in New Amsterdam contained moments of genuine human connection. The settlement was remarkably diverse for its time, with Dutch, French, English, Swedish, Jewish, and African residents creating a tapestry of languages and customs. In market squares, this diversity became visible and audible. Merchants haggled in multiple tongues, children played games that mixed traditions from different continents. Rumors and news traveled through social networks faster than any official communication. Taverns served as informal community centers where social barriers occasionally softened. Over ale and tobacco, sailors shared stories from distant ports. Laborers complained about working conditions. Traders negotiated deals that bypassed official channels. These spaces offered brief respite from the relentless demands of survival, places where laughter could briefly overcome hardship, where shared humanity could emerge from beneath the roles and statuses that defined public life. Women, though largely excluded from formal power, exercised influence through familial networks and economic participation. Some ran boarding houses or small businesses. Others managed households that were themselves complex economic units. Children absorbed this diversity naturally, growing up in an environment where difference was ordinary, where the world beyond the settlement's borders seemed full of possibility rather than merely threat. These small, everyday interactions planted seeds of cosmopolitanism that would eventually become one of New York's defining characteristics. Winter months brought particular challenges to the settlement. The harbor could freeze, trapping ships and cutting off supply lines. Firewood became precious, and inadequate housing meant that cold was not just uncomfortable but deadly. During these months of forced stillness, political tensions often intensified. With less commerce to distract attention, residents focused on grievances, conflicts, and the constant maneuvering for advantage that characterized colonial politics. External threats grew more pressing with each passing year. English territorial ambitions became impossible to ignore. Their colonies were larger, better supplied, and increasingly aggressive in asserting claims. The Dutch West India Company's commitment to defending New Amsterdam was questionable, corporate priorities being what they were. Would Amsterdam send reinforcements if conflict erupted? Would the company risk valuable ships and soldiers for a distant outpost that generated modest profits? Beneath the routines of daily existence, residents could sense that transformation approached. Some welcomed the possibility of English rule, believing it might bring greater stability or opportunity. Others clung to Dutch identity and feared what change might cost them. But whether people embraced or resisted, whether they felt optimistic or anxious, everyone understood that the settlement stood at a threshold. The question was not whether change would come, but when and what price it would demand. In late summer of 1664, English warships appeared in the harbor. Their presence was overwhelming, their message unmistakable: surrender or face bombardment. Director General Stuyvesant, his pride wounded and his authority challenged, initially prepared to resist. But the reality was stark. The settlement had inadequate defenses, limited ammunition, and a population with no appetite for martyrdom. Leading citizens urged pragmatism over principle. What was the point of dying for a company that had never truly invested in their security? The handover occurred without violence. Flags were lowered and raised, official documents signed, oaths of allegiance administered. New Amsterdam became New York, renamed for the Duke of York, brother to the English king. The transition was bureaucratic, almost anticlimactic given its historical significance. Most residents simply continued their lives under new management, adapting as people always adapt when circumstances demand it. The Dutch institutions remained largely intact initially. Trade patterns continued. The diverse population persisted. What changed was the ultimate authority, the distant power to which the colony owed allegiance. For many residents, this mattered less than might be expected. Whether orders came from Amsterdam or London, life remained difficult, opportunities remained limited, and survival remained the primary concern. The conquest was quiet because it changed formal power without immediately transforming daily reality. The people who built, traded, labored, and struggled were the same people the day after as the day before. In taverns and on street corners, speculation replaced uncertainty. Under English rule, would trade expand or contract? Would new settlers arrive in greater numbers? Would the law become more lenient or more strict? These questions animated conversations and shaped decisions about investment, marriage, where to build, what to plant. The city was still small, still crude, still vulnerable, but something fundamental had taken root. The location itself held extraordinary strategic and commercial value. The harbor was among the finest on the Atlantic coast, deep enough for large ships, protected from harsh weather. The rivers provided access to vast interior territories rich in resources. The growing population, despite all its hardships and inequalities, demonstrated that permanent settlement was viable. These advantages would not disappear with a change of flags. In 1664, New York was not yet the city it would become. There were no stock exchanges, no museums, no bridges connecting islands into a unified metropolis. But the DNA was present. The commercial obsession, the diversity, the improvisation, the acceptance of inequality as the price of opportunity, all the characteristics that would define modern New York were already embedded in this rough settlement at the edge of the continent. The people living through these years could not see the future they were building. They were simply trying to survive winter, make a profitable trade, secure a better situation for their children. But their accumulated choices, their daily compromises and ambitions were laying foundations for something unprecedented in human history. What can this forgotten chapter of history teach us today? Perhaps it reminds us that the institutions and cities we take for granted began in chaos and uncertainty. The Manhattan we know, with its wealth and power and cultural influence, emerged from messy improvisation, from exploitation and suffering, from exchange and displacement. Nothing about its rise was inevitable or preordained. It resulted from thousands of individual choices, from systems that favored some while crushing others, from geography and timing, and the relentless human drive to build, acquire, and expand. It also reminds us that transformation rarely announces itself clearly in the moment. The Lenape, engaging in those first trades, could not foresee the erasure of their world. The Dutch settlers building rough homes in muddy streets could not imagine the city of millions that would eventually stand on that ground. The English taking control in 1664 could not predict that this colonial outpost would one day be the financial capital of the world. We live through our own transformations daily, often unable to recognize their true significance until years or decades have passed. Thank you for taking this journey back to the beginning of New York. I hope it has given you a new perspective on how the familiar becomes strange when we truly examine its origins. If you found value in this exploration, please subscribe to our channel. We have more forgotten stories to uncover, more hidden turning points in human civilization that deserve to be remembered and understood. Stay curious, stay questioning, and take care of yourself until we meet again.